The Rhodesian Bush War, also known as the Zimbabwean Liberation War, was a protracted and bloody conflict fought between the white minority government of Rhodesia and African nationalist movements. Spanning 15 years, this guerrilla war was a pivotal struggle for Zimbabwean independence and against colonial-era racial oppression. Background to the conflict. Rhodesia, a British colony, declared unilateral independence in 1965 under Prime Minister Ian Smith. The new government, dominated by the white minority, sought to maintain control over the country while excluding the black majority from meaningful political participation. This declaration was condemned internationally, leading to sanctions and calls for decolonization. The African nationalist movements, led primarily by the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, and the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, began an armed struggle to overthrow the Smith regime and achieve majority rule. Key players. Rhodesian government. The white minority government relied on a well-trained military, including the Rhodesian security forces and special units like the Sela Scouts, to counter guerrilla attacks. African nationalist movements. ZANU, led by Robert Mugabe, aligned with China and pursued Maoist guerrilla tactics. ZAPU, led by Joshua Komu, aligned with the Soviet Union, emphasizing conventional military strategies. Neighboring states and international influence. African nations such as Mozambique, Zambia, and Botswana provided support and bases for guerrilla fighters. Meanwhile, the United States and Britain applied diplomatic pressure for a negotiated settlement, while apartheid South Africa provided limited support to Rhodesia. Phases of the war. Initial skirmishes, 1964 to 1972. Early attacks by ZANU and ZAPU were largely ineffective due to limited resources and internal divisions. Rhodesia's military dominated the early stages, securing its borders and targeting guerrilla camps. Escalation, 1972 to 1976. The war intensified as Mozambique gained independence in 1975, allowing nationalist forces to establish strongholds along Rhodesia's eastern border. Guerrilla attacks increased, targeting infrastructure and rural settlements. Final years, 1976 to 1979. By the late 1970s, international isolation, economic sanctions, and growing guerrilla successes weakened the Rhodesian government. Pressure from South Africa and Western nations forced Smith to negotiate with nationalist leaders. Resolution. The Lancaster House Agreement. In 1979, negotiations at Lancaster House in London brought the conflict to an end. The agreement established a ceasefire, paved the way for democratic elections, and recognized majority rule. In 1980, Zimbabwe officially gained independence, with Robert Mugabe becoming its first prime minister. Legacy of the Rhodesian Bush War. The war left deep scars on Zimbabwe's society and economy, with tens of thousands dead and infrastructure in ruins. However, it also marked a critical victory for anti-colonial movements in Africa. Conclusion. The Rhodesian Bush War was more than a fight for independence. It was a struggle for racial equality and self-determination. Its resolution marked the end of white minority rule in Rhodesia and the birth of modern Zimbabwe, setting a precedent for liberation movements across the continent.